Okay, ready to start. Welcome to the July 5th, 2017 meeting of the Sammamish City Council, and this is a study session. Mr. City Manager?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Tonight, essentially, we have a vast, or I shouldn't say vast, I should say three particular items from community development. If it were vast, we'd need longer than 2 hours. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Jeff Thomas, our Community Development Director.
Thank you. Thank you, Lyman. Good afternoon, Council. I'm not sure if we're experiencing technical difficulties or not. We're going to start with a department report this afternoon to let the council and the public know what we've been up to here for the first 5 months and a few days of the year. And there we go. All right. So a quick reminder of who we are and what we do. And next slide, please. We're going to start with what we do. Community development is generally made up of 3 different divisions. The Permit Center, of course, which are our friendly folks when you walk into the lobby, Tony and Amy and others that work up at the front counter. In addition to intaking, issuing permits, helping customers and citizens alike, the Permit Center staff have also been carrying the lion's share of passport processing for the last number of months and probably the last couple of years, actually. So it's a very busy group. And there's no shortage of activity at the front counter on a day-to-day basis, especially on passport days. The building division has a few different components to it. Building plan review, building inspection, code compliance, something that we all like to talk about and to get things resolved. And starting here in July, our electrical permitting and inspection program will come online as well. We'll be taking that over from L&I. A little more about that later. And of course, the planning division, you see David and I and David Goodman and Kelly and others here on a fairly regular basis. In addition to coming and working with the Planning Commission and Council, we also work on processing what we call current planning projects or land use permits, and so between those two things, the planning division is quite busy as well. So that's what we do in a nutshell. Who we are. All I want to say is that I'm really happy that I got to be Kermit in this graphic, okay? This is who we are. You see our Permit Center group down in the bottom left corner, our building group in the top right corner, and then we kind of divide ourselves up a little bit between the current planning folks and then town center kind of long-range policy planning folks as well. So I don't know, I actually can't name all 5 characters up there, but I know I'm Kermit, so.
I thought you might be the Swedish chef, but.
No, that's Beaker.
That may have been considered. I didn't put this graphic together, so I don't know. But next slide. Thank you. What are we doing? Our 2017 work program was assembled at the end of last year, and we actually have roughly the 17-18 work program, but this is what we're doing right now in 2017. This is this graphic is stretched out over 4 quarters. You can see there at the bottom of the screen, and some things obviously take longer than other things, and some things are really ongoing. But a couple of important notes here. Town center implementation strategies, I'll touch on that in a second. That's ongoing, as we talked with council last year about. Housing strategy update will be starting in the second half of the year. We've got that scheduled to queue up with an introductory session to the Planning Commission after summer break. Land use development permitting, I mentioned that in the last slide, or the last couple slides. We're busy with that, of course. MBP activities, our acronyms, mybuildingpermit.com. That's the electronic submittal and issuance of permits. So Darcy is our primary driver of that program for us and implementing that. Permit process improvements, I'm going to speak about that a little bit later. We just completed our first chapter of that journey. And of course, again, down at the bottom of the screen, code compliance. It's ongoing. It cycles and varies in volumes, but we're working on getting the volume down. So, next slide. I'm going to hit on a few other items here in a little bit more detail. Town Center is really like a lot of work that we're doing in community development right now. It's just not community development staff. It really is an interdepartmental, citywide effort. Town Center is certainly one of those projects, working closely with Public Works, Parks, City Manager's Office, and so forth. You've seen some of this information come to you already this year, talking about increasing our communication strategies around Town Center, some additions to our website. I know Tim's been running a couple of profiles in the monthly newsletter that's went out recently, and I know we have a couple more planned. We've talked to you already about TDRs earlier this year and regional stormwater, and city staff will be coming back to work with you more on that. Southeast 4th is moving forward, and of course, as we move through these short-term strategies that we talked to council about last year, we're also going to start moving into some of those moderate-term strategies, of which really focus, just to remind council, on more of the plan and the code itself, and talking about looking at some changes with that. So that's Town Center ongoing.
Good presentation.
Yeah. There we go. Urban forestry, we're actually going to have a whole discussion about that a little later this evening, so I'm not going to talk about this a whole lot, but we're moving forward with implementing our comprehensive plan policy of getting an urban forestry management plan off the ground and underway, and we're certainly moving in that direction, and we'll talk about the scope of work a little later this evening. Next slide, please. Sign code updates, a really important project that the council actually just recently completed. Two things I'll say about this. One is, in reflecting back on the process and talking with other jurisdictions, I really just want to say the legislative efficiency at which the Planning Commission and the Council completed that project was really great. I'm hearing stories about a lot of other jurisdictions really struggling to move through that legislative review. So that's really good. And as you'll recall, we still have some work to do related to electronic reader boards as well as murals. So we are scoping out the electronic reader board necessary code amendment, and we'll be moving that through the process here starting shortly to the Planning Commission and then on to City Council. So, electrical program implementation, real quickly, we're really excited to get this underway July 1st. We'll be taking over electrical permitting and inspection from the Department of Labor and Industries, L&I, and we've got a few more things to do before we really get this off the ground July 1. Darcy and Kurt are working hard on the back end. For example, our permit tracking system, making the necessary changes to be able to incorporate electrical permits into our system. We are in the process of hiring a full-time electrical inspector that will jump on board here hopefully in a couple weeks. And finally, the actual codes that we're going to use to review permits and do inspections. Council will be completing second reading of that ordinance tomorrow evening and getting those codes put into official adoption.
And just a reminder to council is that that'll be fully self-sufficient. We'll have no taxpayer implications of that. So it's revenue neutral.
So we're increasing employees, but they're covered by the inspections.
Correct.
Yep. One of our favorite projects, of course. East Lake Sammamish Trail, segment 2B. This is continuing. This was a substantial staff effort at the beginning of the year. Council will recall the Shoreline Substantial Development Permit, SSDP. We received that from the county late last year, and once the application was determined complete for processing, it went out for a 30-day public comment period. We received more than 850 original written public comments related to this project. By far and away, hands down, the most that I've ever seen in my 20 years of doing land use planning and development permits. It was a really large effort to go through to index those, categorize them, and get them organized in a manner that we could hand them off to the county to begin their review and response to those. In addition to that, in early April, the city completed its complete first technical review of the actual permit itself, and we send our technical review comments and changes back to the county. Permitting is a little bit like a chess clock. County submits, it's determined complete, as any applicant would. We do our review, we hit the chess clock, it goes back to the applicant for their work. They're doing that right now. They have 90 days to do that. And so they're on the clock right now, and they're due back into us by early July. And then they'll hit the chess clock, and we're back on the review. Our hope, to be determined, but our hope is to get this application in front of the hearing examiner for an open record public hearing before the end of the year, sometime in the fall most likely. So that's going to be driven by the quality of the work that the county submits to us before July, and our ability to take that information and review it and prepare the necessary staff report and exhibits and everything to get in front of the hearing examiner. So that process change, council completed that process change earlier this year as part of our Shoreline Master Program amendments that we were working with Ecology on. So it's now a type 4 process. It requires that hearing examiner review, and the hearing examiner is now the decision maker for the city on those. So I mentioned process improvement a little bit earlier. We took our first journey into lean management. Essentially, lean is a process that originated out of Toyota many years ago, applied to manufacturing instances. It's been very popular with public sector and public sector process over the last number of years. The state of Washington has done a lot of work in their different agencies with lean management. And we took our first jump in earlier this year with our permit financial guarantee and bond process. This was a joint effort between Public Works, Planning, and Finance. And essentially, in a nutshell, what it is we take a process. It can be any process. It could be bonds. It could be passport processing, HR recruitments. And we deconstruct the process, and then we put it back together. And we look for ways to streamline the process, eliminate unnecessary steps, and increase our working capacity without necessarily having to add more staff or more consultants. So on the scale of these types of efforts that I've been involved with before, this was a relatively small one, but it was an important one. Leading up to this, we actually had a focus group, a small focus group of customers that we assembled for this, and we got some really good direct feedback from them on what they liked and didn't like about our former process. We were able to use that information in deconstructing the process and identifying improvements. What you see here on this slide is average savings per year. We think with the improvement measures that were identified and put into the reconstructed process, we're going to save 162 staff hours a year, which equates to a little over $8,000. That may not seem like a lot, but it actually equates to about 45 minutes for every bond that we receive here at the city. So the processing, the intake of that bond and the processing of it, it's about 45 minutes on every one. So it's a meaningful measure, even though it doesn't seem like a lot in the grand scale of things. But you start doing that 2, 3, 4 times over with different things, and you start creating a little bit more working capacity for your staff. And more streamlined process, more satisfying process to customers and citizens, and it does start to add up. So this was our first journey. Again, Public Works and Finance and DCD, it was a good process. You see the part of the group there on the screen. We had a Seahawk join us for the 2 days, unnamed Seahawk, but it was really good. So, quick update on permit center activity. You see building permits here on the left and land use permits on the right. 2015, 2016, and 2017 year-to-date through June 1, May 31, end of May. So we had a fairly sizable uptick 2015 to 2016 in building permits, and a more moderate uptick in land use permits from 15 to 16. We're trending in 2017. Building permits is going to be pretty close to 2016 numbers if our activity continues. Land use permits are going to be down, down quite a bit actually. So don't know the exact reason for that, but we're keeping a close eye on that. Pardon me?
I don't think there's much land left.
That could be part of the reason. A couple of quick notes on the land use permits. That 34 land use permit applications received to date, what's not part of that 34, interestingly enough, 0 zoning variances, 0 shoreline variances, and 0 preliminary subdivisions received in 2017. And I believe we have 3 preliminary short plat applications that have been received. So the work that we're doing right now with subdivisions and short plats that you're hearing about are almost exclusively requests, applications that were received in 2016.
I'm sorry, that were received.
Received in 2016. Yeah. Okay. Oh yes, Kathy.
How do those numbers for the building permits compare to what our expectations or what we had said that we would be building or what we had agreed to build?
Yeah. So those numbers that you see there on the screen, actually, you jogged my mind to make a really important point. Those numbers that you see on the screen there are not new construction units. Those are total building permits. So those would include a plumbing permit or a mechanical permit for a single-family homeowner to replace a hot water heater, for example. A new deck on a house, but then they also include new single-family construction as well, and town center permits as well. So it's an all-inclusive number. How it compares, we budgeted for 17-18 to be close in building permit volume to what we were trending in 2016. So certainly from a workload perspective, Kurt and his staff are very busy with plan review and inspections. Yeah. And of course, then that number will also trend up over time because now we're going to take on electrical permits as well.
So roughly how many homes were built? Can you tell us the breakdown of that? How many homes were built in 2016?
That's data I don't have right off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to follow up with council to give you a little bit of breakdown of new home construction. I think what you're seeing here is, part of that is you're seeing land use actions that went through and were processed in 14 and 15 and started to translate into some of that uptick there in 2016. And what we're seeing in 17, it's kind of the build out of prior land use actions that were processed by the city. Okay, this is actually our almost last slide, and I'm going to turn this over to David Pyle to speak to. We wanted to provide you a little update on some of our GIS mapping capabilities and activity that we've been working on here recently. And David, with that, I'll just hand it right over to you.
Thank you, Jeff. Good evening, David Pyle, Community Development Department. So what we wanted to do here was to just give you a snapshot about what we're doing behind the scenes to provide more robust tools for our staff that allows our staff to get a better idea quickly of what's going on the ground. And this is a process that was put in place some years ago. There are multiple different pieces to it. Our Public Works GIS staff have been largely responsible for many of these, so the credit goes to them. Although I also want to point out that this is still in its infancy, and we are in the process of trying to pull it all together and put it into more of a powerful tool that actually means something. Because where we currently have all these different tools, we have to go to each one individually to look something up. But it is possible for us, if we are to pursue a GIS strategic plan or a sort of a next steps for the GIS staff, and complete that would give us some idea about where we could go with this. So the first one up on the upper left is the Sammamish property tool. This is one that's most recently completed, includes aerial photographs, streams, wetlands, historic structures or historic resources, I guess, all the roads, parcel data, et cetera. The as-built library is a really interesting one. That one is one you can go to and see, you can actually find all of the as-builts of how something was constructed pretty quickly. So those are all scanned and in there. These are all internal tools, so they're not available to the public. And there's reason for that because a lot of this deals with interpretation of something, and if someone had access to this, they might interpret things differently and then make decisions on purchasing a property or doing something that they weren't actually interpreting or understanding the information in front of them correctly. The next one is the Storm Bandit, and this one is a platform that was set up by our public works staff that maps out our stormwater system here in the city, so we can identify where there are pipes, where they're going, crossings, et cetera. The LiDAR swipe is a really interesting tool, and that shows you can actually swipe across the screen and see the changes in landscape over the years based on different generations of LiDAR. The historic landmarks and resources is a really valuable one for us at the counter when we have somebody coming in talking about wanting to develop a piece of property where there might be a historic resource. We can quickly go to that and see what there might be on the site. The forest practices tool is one that's really valuable in typing streams. That one is one that is maintained by the state. The Coastal Atlas is another one that's really important, and that is one that is maintained by the Department of Ecology, and it includes oblique photographs of the city's shoreline. They were recently updated, so there's some new ones there. So basically, if I could, is there a way to get out of this screen? I could show you, for example, whoops, control, there you go, thank you. This is the most recent addition, which is the Sammamish property tool. And this one is really helpful for us because you can actually go in here and start to, if you wanted to look at a specific piece of property, you could zoom in and then you can start to add stuff back to it. And you can see like the parcels will turn on. You can see the current projects from the current projects map. There's things in here that are really helpful, like the no disturbance layer that we've talked about recently, zoning, the aerial photographs are all listed here, so you can see different generations of aerial photographs. So this is something that we're creating internally and maintaining internally, whereas we used to use IMAP in the past. The data in IMAP was not something that we were in control of. This is something we are in control of, and we have the ability to update the data sets as needed. And we are also able to set the scale and precision to a level that we understand and how these layers relate to each other.
David, I have a quick question. On when you're talking about the layers list, and you said you're in control of the data, have you guys updated, like if you look at King County IMAP, some of the areas that show wetlands are where there are houses currently, so it's clear that their wetland delineation on the map is not correct. Is that more updated on the Sammamish site or not necessarily?
Not yet. That's a fairly large work product, and often those wetland maps are the result of remote sensing, where they had an algorithm that looked for certain conditions, and when those conditions, like they looked for things like depressions, they looked for proximity to streams, they looked for soil types, and those were all existing data sets, and that algorithm would basically map a potential wetland area, although it might be in where a house is located. So those are always subject to ground truthing. One of the things we are going to be doing is working on trying to find a way to bring, when an application comes in the door and they have a wetland delineation, as part of that application, how do we have that brought into this so that if you were to turn on the wetlands, that the actual delineation from that project shows here on the map. Mm-hmm. So that's in the works. There's some steps to that because it has to come from the applicant and make it all the way into the GIS. So it takes a little bit of effort.
Sure. And then one more question on the layer list. You can stack layers on top of one another, like IMAP, correct?
That is correct. Although you cannot, like GIS, actually move them and toggle them up and down, in the actual GIS software, you can actually prioritize them differently, so that you can also turn them on at different levels of transparency. We're experimenting with this. As I said, it's in its infancy, and we're trying to see what else can be done with it. Our GIS staff have been great trying to experiment with how to make this a more powerful tool for our planning staff to use.
Thanks.
Kathy?
Yes. David, we're going to be talking about R1 zoning in a little bit. At what point would you think that this mapping tool is going to be ready to kind of inform us a little bit better on that decision of an understanding of why certain areas are zoned R1 or in the no disturbance area, so that we can really see, putting layer upon layer, I think I heard you say, and identifying those areas so that we aren't creating problems for people who are zoned R1 who maybe shouldn't be in that area, and identifying those areas where we should maintain those R1s and possibly even expand them.
So if I may, I think that's something we're going to discuss a little bit in the next item, but what David's went through here can certainly be useful in that regard. There may be a more analytical aspect to some of that work that I think we'll get into once we have that discussion here next. So,
Thank you.
yeah. So, Mayor, that concludes the staff presentation for the department update.
Great. Any other questions for staff? Now, David, in this layering tool, you said it's not available to the public at this point. Is the goal to have a more sophisticated layering tool available to the public?
The goal, yeah, one of our goals is to create a different tool that has specific layers that are included there. One of the problems that we have is, for example, say someone is do I have a wetland on my property? We don't want them to go to that map and think that there is or is not a wetland based on the indicator that there might be a wetland. All the map tells us is there might be something there, and whether or not we would want a field reconnaissance done on the ground. So there's a lot of interpretation that goes along with reading these maps, and we would want to make sure that anybody who's reading them is aware of the
proper disclaimers, huh?
Yeah.
Tom?
Thanks, Jeff. Good report. Would be also very interested in seeing the numbers of the housing permits as well. So I imagine all 7 of us would like to see that. In the area of metrics, we have a relatively new and much reinforced tree retention code, and which you did not mention. And I'm wondering if you could share some information on how well we're doing with that in terms of, how many situations have we investigated, how many turned out to be not permitted versus permitted. Also, I know there is a replanting requirement in some cases where we do allow removal. And frankly, in light of a note we exchanged the other day, I was curious as to what the follow-up is on the replanting requirement.
Sure. So in response to the first question, we'll definitely follow up tomorrow with an email to council on new single-family permitting activity over the last couple of years, and then through 2017, end of May. In regards to the implementation of the tree regulations, we've actually had very few actual enforcement cases where we've needed to pursue penalties. And I think council's been involved in every one of them so far. So there's a couple of them. They're very large monetary values, you'll recall. And we were able to successfully navigate our way through those and bring those to a successful conclusion. In terms of maybe, Tom, what you're getting at is a little bit more maybe the day-to-day permitting activity with trees. Of the calls that we get, and honestly, back in 2015, when that new chapter 21A37 was moving through the legislative review, I thought we were really in for it from an enforcement perspective. That hasn't turned out to be the case. Word spread quickly about the new regulations, and we've had an incredible response to people coming in and getting permits and following through with permitting activity. So the calls that we do get, I have to tell you, I don't have the percentage off the top of my head, but an incredible majority of those calls, we end up responding to the citizens that are calling in. That site has a permit, a legal permit to do the work. So it's been very different than certainly what I expected, and probably what some of the council members expected too back in 2015.
Well, thanks. The primary purpose of the tree retention orders was to actually retain trees, not to punish people for violating the law. So it'd be really interesting data point to look at the trend in tree removal permits, from year to year as an example.
Sure. Yeah.
Against
We have
the
that.
enforcement cases. Because I think that sends a message to the public at large, too.
Yeah. So we would be able to do, it'd be just over 2 months of 2015, and then a full year in 2016, and then to date through May of 2017.
Forget 2015, let's just start at 16.
16? Sure. Yeah.
Okay, Kathy?
Yeah, and Jeff, when you bring those building permits back, would you also provide a look into the future? I know a number of us have been invited to neighborhood meetings. Things have not gone through pre-app necessarily yet. But if you could just give us a little picture of what you're seeing as potentially coming in the near couple of months. We see that big sky banner up there, and I know some things have been talked about in the town center.
Sure.
But it would be really helpful to get an idea of what might be coming, again, through maybe the next 6 to 8 months.
Lots in the queue type of data? Sure.
And I'm well aware that there was one that didn't even come in for a pre-app, and the neighborhood meeting went out, and it was 80-some homes. But those type of things, if we can just have some of those included, even though they may be a little ephemeral at this point, and may change significantly.
Yeah,
To
we can
give us
work,
an idea.
we can work on that.
Thank you.
Tom?
I just want to to clarify what we're asking for. I think you said single-family residence, but I'm thinking we want to see the number of units, right?
Right.
Which might be included in the multiple dwelling. It's the number of units that we're
Yeah.
looking for. Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
We'll break it out, town center, R zones.
Okay,
for
good.
you. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Bob?
Thank you. Since we're talking about the tree retention ordinance, I'm curious, it's been quite a while since that's been in place, and we talked about receiving areas for replanting. And I'm curious, number one, if we've had requests that people have come in and we needed a receiving area, and what we've done, you know, if we've had those requests, that would be really at the front desk. And I think it would also be interesting, you may not be tracking this, but it would be interesting to know how many trees are replanted, just to get an idea, again, from the community, how effective we are at restoring trees with the existing tree retention ordinance.
So just quickly, if I may, in response to receiving areas, I do know, I'll have to talk with staff a little bit. I do know we've had a couple of conversations with folks about possible off-site plantings. I don't recall specifically if any of them actually came to fruition, but we'll look into that, and then we can take a look at that other piece of data as well to see what we can put together for
Do we have
council.
a bank right now of some that need to be replanted but have nowhere to go?
No.
Okay.
No. And also identifying receiving sites. one of the ideas in the broader scope for the urban forestry plan was to actually look at identifying appropriate receiving sites, to make pre-approved sites of sorts, to make that process a little bit more streamlined instead of having to have an original conversation every time about using the off-site planting provision. So,
Yeah, if I could just comment as well. I remember, going through this, the staff actually showed in one particular area where an individual is trying to make trees fit on their property, and the original plan was trees underneath the eaves in between two houses. The likelihood of survival was zero. And working with the property owner, they were able to actually work something out that was very favorable. And so what I'm curious about is if I'm today going to put in a permit, request a permit to take a tree out, I am required by our ordinance to replant. And I'm just wondering if they're running into, there's any tracking or any idea of what is somebody doing when they replant? Are they putting the trees in an area that has survival or not? And if they did have a tough situation, do we have a solution for them with a receiving area? That was the whole intent of doing that.
Christy.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks for your presentation. I was curious about those land use, it could be short plats or long plats, but how many are still under the old tree regulations that are still under construction? I know you might not know, but Highcroft's old, right? Still under construction.
That's correct.
And how many of these that we're seeing now are under the new ones? All of them that we're seeing now?
So the vast majority of short plats and subdivisions let me break this into two categories. The first category are still being processed, so they haven't broke ground yet. The vast majority of those are under the new regulations at this point.
Okay.
Staff has done an amazing job the last 18 months of bringing our backlog of workload that existed through the 2013s and 2014s into 2015. So what we're doing right now is we've still got some 2015 projects that we're finishing up processing, but the vast majority of our work is into 2016 at this point. So that would be under the new regulations.
Right.
What you're seeing out on the ground in reality is still a little bit of a mixed bag between projects that were vested under the former regulations and now starting to see projects that are vested under the new regulations. The exact breakdown percentage of how much is of one and how much of the other, we'd have to look into, but you'll recall back in 2016 when we were having inquiries from folks about, the application of the new regulations, what council and what the public heard a lot of was, well, all the projects that are under construction right now are all under the former regulations, but that's now, that's really starting to shift now, and we're kind of in that mixed area, something of 50-50 or less of one more than the other. Ask that same question 12 months from now, and it's almost going to be exclusively under the new regulations.
Okay. Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, Tom.
Jeff, I'm not sure I got the answer to my final question, and that is the issue of follow-up on replanting. What's the procedure there? If someone gets, say, a private individual takes down X number of trees with a replanting requirement of Y, how do we make sure that actually happens?
Yeah. So I'm going to actually let David Pyle chime in here, but we do not have the human resource here at City Hall to go out and inspect tree permits after the work is complete. So we aren't doing that like we do a final inspection for a new home, for example. But David, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the interface between the customer and our staff at the front counter and issuing the permit and so forth?
Sure. So we after the new tree rules were passed, we put in place some informational handouts on the city's website that outlines the process, and we broke it into different categories, whether it's a hazard tree, an unhealthy tree, an imminent threat tree, or standard tree removal on somebody's property. And we tried to clarify that when you have a hazard tree or an unhealthy tree, there's exemptions written into those tree rules, but we have asked for clear documentation from an arborist. We actually asked for forms filled out by a certified arborist. The staff are trained in how to check if the arborist is certified or qualified to fill those forms out. The staff do a cursory review of the forms, and if we see areas of question, we send them. We have a third-party arborist on contract now that we send them to. So we do verify that the trees are actually eligible to be considered as unhealthy or hazardous. And when they are, then we are able to issue a permit for those types of trees pretty quickly. They can be removed. They require replanting. And we ask that they show on a site plan, which can be hand sketched or can be out of the iMap or out of our new map browser if we print it at the desk, where they X out where the trees will go. We have been, talking with one of the biggest things about compliance with replanting is actually instilling a sense of stewardship in the actual customer. Because even if they were to replant it, based on the way the rules are written, it's not something where there's an easement around it or something like that. So they actually have to want to own it on their property and take care of it. So giving them some flexibility with regard to where they're putting it in a logical location, integrating it into their landscaping, et cetera, is really important. And our staff, our permit center staff are getting really good at that. With regard to the trees that are the regular, a standard healthy tree that's being removed, where you're allowed 2 per year or whatever the table says you can do based on the size of your property. The staff have gotten very good at assessing the size of the property, using aerial photographs to determine if it's forested or not, looking for conflicts with things like wetlands or streams. Then the replanting, they do have to come in and show replanting with a like variety of tree in a similar location. So we are more specific with that action than we are with the hazards or unhealthies. So it is also that engagement with the applicant, trying not to turn them off to the process, so to speak, and trying to engage them and give them a sense of stewardship. That's one of the best methods to ensure the long-term success of a tree that's planted.
David, if it's the wrong variety to begin with, you don't want to replant with the same variety, right?
Or if
So,
it has limited
so
root
with regard to varieties, we went ahead and there's a great book. It's called I call it the Pojar book, and we have a landscape book that we use, and we look at things like structure and aesthetic, and how does it fit. So it's not just the variety itself, but what size was the tree that was removed, and what size is the tree that you're replanting going to get to. And looking at trying to replicate that structure over time is really important, and I've trained the staff on that and looking at what they're trying to put back in. Don't take out a healthy fir and on your property and put back a vine maple. That's not acceptable. So
Okay, thank you. Christy?
I had just a similar line of thought, but a question too. When you get these forms that identify a diseased tree, do you ever see laminated root rot being listed there, or we don't know until they get into the ground or the tree's fallen over?
yes, we do.
Okay, and so I'm assuming then we're not telling them to go and replace it with another Douglas fir.
When we have diseased trees, unhealthy trees, we often ask that their arborist as part of that process, and I believe it's in the form as well, the informational handouts that we have for unhealthy trees, we ask that arborist make a recommendation on replanting. Because the arborist is already out there analyzing the disease condition, and like you said, we don't want to have them put back a tree that's going to be attacked by some sort of blight that will affect the tree that's just been replanted.
Good. Romero?
Yeah, 2 questions. First of all, going back, I think you called it the landscape book that you use there for a shortage. So as you're replacing the Douglas fir, if I'm understanding you, that you're looking at the type of canopy that had provided, and then you can replace it with a variety of other ones that have a similar type of canopy. Is that correct? Is how we're trying to accomplish now?
Yes, and the structure in terms of the height, the canopy type, we're trying to also understand what their objective is. If someone's wanting to remove legally remove trees on their property that are healthy. Well, what is their objective? Is there crowding? Is there a shade issue? Are they making a landscape change? We want the trees to be successful. We don't want the trees to be taken for granted as being replanted. And it's important that we talk to the applicant in that way and try to understand what they're doing. And we have sent a few of these out to our consulting arborist to try and get a better understanding of what might be the best outcome.
Okay, thank you. The second thing is we've talked about the alerts and systems. The one thing we haven't talked here that I'd like to see is over time the council has asked for feedback and monitoring of certain projects like Lancaster Way, the Chestnut Estate. We had talked earlier about the East Lake Sammamish Trail. But often what happens and it gets overtaken by events and we don't find out until a decision has been made and then citizens notify us. And so is there a way to build in an early alert system to the council so we don't have to wait till a decision's made by community development and citizens, as in the case of Lancaster Way, then notify us and then we're caught off guard despite having asked for that early notice?
Sure. So I think our development map on the city's website is a good first step in that direction. So any of you, any citizen can go on that interface tool on our website and be able to see applications that are being received by the city. What I'm hearing, Ramiro, is you're interested in maybe a little bit more of a formal reporting structure to city council?
Yeah, on the significant projects that have sensitivity with our community as the ones I've just listed out there, to make sure that they're brought to us, they can bring them.
And if there's a variation or.
Well, that was my next question that I was going to say. I understood that on variations or waivers or deviations, as you want to call them, those are now going to be captured by the system. Is that correct? That people could go in, and so as you're considering one of these deviations, that those will be listed in the GIS system so citizens can go into their developments and see as those start to arise? Or will there be a mechanism? At one time we had spoken about alerting the council prior to that final decision and giving us those, whether it's as an addendum to our reports, just so that we're aware of those.
So I think in Steve's Public Works report just a month ago, he updated the council on 2017 deviation requests received. My understanding is that something like that would be part of the project description. So yes, we can definitely incorporate it in that regard. You know, I think in working, having Steve and I work with Lyman and creating a little bit more of a formal reporting structure for some of these larger projects, that's something that council sounds interested in hearing, and I don't see why we can't certainly do that.
Okay, thank you.
Send that out periodically.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. I think that's it on that item. Next item is the R1 land use density analysis. Falso?
Yeah, we're here for the evening, the group that's here. But so just a quick introduction then. David Goodman will do a presentation here, a short presentation for the council to get some of the discussion going. When this subject came up last fall during council's discussion and deliberation in regards to the 2017 docketing process, which of course we'll all remember, the docketing process is putting things on the docket to go through legislative review to amend the comprehensive plan. Council wanted staff to go back and take a look at, you know, gosh, how do we end up with this R1 zoning? Where did it come from? What are the reasons why it exists? And, you know, what does it look like? So consider this presentation here this evening somewhat of a, back when you were in college and you were asked to do a research paper on something, you would often start with doing a literature review. What is existing information that exists on the subject before I get in and start doing, tearing it apart and doing analysis and developing, you know, analytical methodologies and so forth. So this is really the literature review to the research paper. Staff went back, and it's been a little bit of a continuum, as I'll point out here in a second. We went back and we started looking at older information. Some of that information was pre-incorporation. zoning maps at incorporation, the 2003 adoption of the zoning map with the interim zoning on it and so forth that encompasses some of this R1 zoning. And we've put together some findings that are in the memo and that you'll see here in the presentation this evening. The one thing I do want to add that's going to be a little bit new that David Goodman is going to speak to here in the presentation that's not in the memo is the finding of a couple of policies in the 2003 Sammamish Comprehensive Plan that do speak to interim zoning and some criteria looking at whether property should be zoned R1 or not. So that was in the 2003 comp plan. It was part of the zoning map that was adopted in 2003. And it's an important piece of the picture here. It's something that we didn't come across until after the packet materials went out last week. So we're going to assemble that language into an email that we'll get out to council tomorrow so you can take a look at it yourself as well. With that, David, I'm going to ask you to jump into the slides here, and we'll go through those and talk about next steps at the end of it.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, Council. So, as Jeff mentioned, I'll provide a little bit of context for why we're here before you talking about this issue. I'll go a little bit into the history of R1 parcels within the city of Sammamish. Talk a little bit about the relationship between those R1 parcels and our GMA targets, our housing growth targets. And also talk a little bit, I'll turn it over to Kelly Hildy to my left here to talk a little bit about how the Transfer of Development Rights program that we're working on has some complementary goals to R1 that might be an alternative way to deal with some of the issues that we're talking about around this topic. And then I'll wrap it all up, and Jeff will be back up at the podium to facilitate a discussion on all these issues. So last November, you had before you a couple of comprehensive plan amendment proposals that were seeking to change zoning from R1 up to R4. And the council didn't eventually put those proposal on the docket, but you did make the suggestion that the staff look into kind of do some background research for a higher level discussion about R1 zoning. So we did that. We looked into this from a lot of different angles. It touches on a lot of different issues here in the city. And so most of what you'll see here is you can consider a bit of background information and kind of a jumping off point when determining what the next steps are going to be based on this information. So, question on everybody's mind is, where did this R1 zoning come from? Earliest we can tell, well, we know that much of the zoning, including R1, was inherited from King County when the city incorporated. And there's a lot of discussion about the relationship between R1 parcels and environmentally critical areas. And what we found is, while there is some correlation between R1 and environmentally critical areas, they're not an exact match. There's some, and I'll show you a map on the next slide here that'll actually overlay those two things so that you can see them on top of one another. But actually, based on information we have from the 1993 King County adopted East Sammamish update plan, there are a couple other reasons that they zone particular parcels R1 in addition to potential environmental sensitivity. And that included having that an area would have open space value, and also that it could function as a separator between different growth areas to kind of serve as a buffer between those. And it also looked at zoning certain parcels R1 due to perceived long-term obstacles to the provision of services and infrastructure. And finally, they also looked at whether an area had already been substantially developed with a 1 acre lot pattern. So here are two maps you might find useful when thinking about this issue. On the left there is just the city boundaries, and then all those parcels in yellow are the R1 parcels. And then on the right, we have this pretty cool map that basically overlays environmentally critical areas, which are all those kind of colorful, nebulous type shapes, on top of R1 parcels, which are in the light blue. So you can see, especially in the northwest and southwest, you've got a pretty heavy overlap between environmentally critical areas and R1 parcels. But in some other parts of the city, it's not as clear a relationship. So it's possible that some of those parcels were determined to have some of those other characteristics that the county was looking at. And it should also be mentioned that some of these environmentally critical areas only came into being once the city had incorporated and didn't exist when this zoning first came to be under the county. So the next step in this history is related to the city's first comp plan adopted in 2003, and Jeff alluded to this earlier. 2003 comp plan, we saw the introduction of this interim zoning designation that we have on both our long-term land use map and our current zoning map. And actually, the purpose of the interim zoning was not focused on upzoning, but actually on downzoning. So the interim zoning designation was given to parcels that the city wanted to analyze further to determine whether they would be better off downzoned from either R4 to and R6 to R1. And that was supported by this land use policy that directed the city to analyze or directed the staff, I should say, to analyze and validate proposed reclassifications of properties to R1 prior to the implementation of new classifications. And this policy, underneath this policy was a list of criteria that the city should look at in determining whether to downzone something to R1. And that was mostly focused on environmentally critical areas. So essentially the criteria was that a parcel was vacant and underdeveloped and either was within Special Overlay District 190, which is now erosion hazard areas near sensitive water bodies, or Special Overlay District 180, which is wetland management areas. So these interim zoning districts have basically stuck around since then. They look exactly the same as they did when they were adopted in 2003. And that's the little picture there is actually cut from the 2003 comp plan map, and which might look familiar to you because it essentially looks the same on our current map.
Quick question, sorry. So just for clarification for us as well as those watching, so there was a land use policy that was created with the 2003 comp plan, and basically subsequent councils never went back to actually change this. Is that correct? So it's just stayed that interim zoning, is that correct?
As far as I can tell, that's correct. And in my, perusal of the 2015 comp plan, the overlay is still there. The zoning designation is still there, but the comp plan actually doesn't make any reference to the interim zoning.
Thanks.
May I ask for you to go back to the previous slide? I just wanted to look at the zoning for a second. I don't know if I can tell from the size of that. I had a question of a development that I knew there that if it's R1, I know it's not built out at R1. I think it was consolidated into one area. It's zoned R1, but probably built out. If you drove through it, it would look like R4. I'm just wondering if there's any other properties like that.
You mean clustering then?
Clustered, yes. So, the designation is R1, but the lots are not.
That's because of clustering.
Right.
Yeah.
I know there are a number of instances like that, and if you zoom in on this map, you can see that some of the the parcels look fairly small, even though there are one. So that
In fact, now that I look at it, I can see that it's all the blue area. That if it's built out and it's R1 with more than a dot of an area, it's probably under that.
Okay. You still want to hold off?
Maybe I'll comment now.
Okay, Kathy?
Just for historical purposes, I have a copy of the 1982 comp plan, and it starts off talking about the fact that we were rural, and through this process, and it was a multi-year process, it started in 78 and was finalized by the county in 82, and they looked at this community. They set areas aside near the lakes and along the lakefront as higher density because they were looking to promote or looking at places where they could promote public sewers. Part of their policy specifically calls out that they would zone R1 along all of the sensitive areas, along the steep slopes and the critical areas, the landslide hazard areas, the seismic hazard, the wetlands, fish-bearing waters, and flood hazard. And so I think it's helpful to understand this because there are some people that have lived here long enough to be aware of the fact of what their zoning was. And specifically, one of my neighbors came into the permit counter and wanted to build an outbuilding, and he said he was R1. And they said, well, you can't do this. Well, he was R1 under this plan, but it changed later on, and he became a different zone, and where it's 4 per acre, but he wasn't aware of that. So there are people who think they're R1 and are not. And there are others who just are confused about what they are. So I think it's important to understand that through this period of time, there are people that have lived through multiple different zonings. Not everybody knows what the changes were or why the reasons changed. And it should be part of the conversation, I think, when people come to the permit counter, to ensure that you're looking at their land and looking at the current zoning rather than perhaps the zoning they think they were. And when you look at this map, most of the area was actually R1, and it was intended to be left R1 because they considered most of this area landslide hazard, steep slopes, and agricultural. So you can have the map if you like.
Sure. Thank you. So moving along towards present day, two other points of interest. In 2005, the city switched from a gross density to a net density calculation for determining buildable area on a lot. And then in 2012, there was a docket proposal that pushed a pilot program that would have allowed R1 properties to use gross density rather than net density to, give them a little more development potential. That proposal was discussed by the council a number of times. It initially made it onto a list of things to consider as part of the 2015 comp plan, but it was ultimately not included in that update. So, but there was about a year and a half of discussion about that. So moving on to growth management in R1, just a point of clarification that the city, as you know, the city adopted a housing target of 4,640 new housing units during the time, during the 25-year period. And in doing so, the city established that it was actually able, using its existing zoning, to meet that target. All this is just to say that no upzoning of R1 is strictly necessary in order to meet the city's housing target. Also of note here is that the city is going to receive its new housing target within the next couple of years for use when putting together the 2023 comp plan. And at that point, there might be some new discussion based on whatever that number is that touches on this issue again. But for now, there's no upzoning is strictly necessary for that purpose. And I'll turn it over to Kelly to talk a little bit about the relationship between R1 and our TDR program.
So thank you, David. So like R1 zoning, our TDR program has a similar goal, and that is to conserve environmentally sensitive areas and open space with a public benefit in the R zones, and to take that density and transfer it into our town center, our appropriate zone for that density. Next slide. Our TDR program currently identifies 4 areas within the city, and we call these our sending site areas. These are the Inglewood and Thompson subbasins, our erosion hazard areas, and our wetland management areas. So properties within one of these 4 are eligible to send their density to the town center. And we are currently, what our program offers is an application for those property owners that are interested in certifying their TDR credits through the city. They would come in here, we'd review their application, we would certify their TDRs, and then it would be a private real estate transaction between a property owner that has certified credits to a developer within town center. Again, and by doing so, they would have to put a conservation easement on their property, and that would be recorded to the city. And therefore, that property in these zones would be preserved, and those sensitive areas would be protected.
Kelly, does that include specifically the Ebright Creek Basin and the other Kokanee basins? I thought we talked about.
My question.
No, it's just specific to the Inglewood and Thompson. So yeah, so Ebright is within, I believe, the Thompson Basin, yes.
What about Zacchaeus?
Do you know?
Pretty close. Hard to tell.
Didn't we say Zacchaeus, Ebright, and what was the other one?
Pine Lake.
Pine Lake?
Pine Lake.
So yeah, ours would be George, Davis, and Ebright within the Inglewood and Thompson. That's what's currently identified within our code.
How did
That's
that
something
come
we can
about?
review.
How did that come about to designate those?
You know, I don't have the history on that, but I can look into that and get back to you.
Council discussion, when we were talking about the Kokanee program, right?
Were those protections that's right?
Sure.
My point is, it could be expanded if we want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Kelly, before you move on, if you took all 4 of these maps and made them one, how much of the city's covered?
Well, the quick math in my head would say a significant portion of the city. But I could do further analysis on that and get back to you.
That'd be an interesting data point. Thank you.
Actually, the receiving site's in the sending site,
Yeah.
Yeah.
the town center.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, because town center is actually divided by the Inglewood and Thompson Basin.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so just to sum up, our R1 parcels were largely inherited from the county upon incorporation. They are correlated with, but not necessarily directly related to, environmentally critical areas. The city has had a number of attempts to resolve some issues related to R1, whether it was upzoning, downzoning, providing more flexibility, providing less flexibility, but none of these have really come to a full conclusion. R1 zoning is not required, or excuse me, upzoning R1 properties is not required to meet any sort of housing target that the city has related to the GMA and the comprehensive plan. And as Kelly just informed, the current TDR program has some interesting overlaps with some of the issues that we're discussing and might be an interesting alternative to reach some of those goals, specifically protecting environmentally sensitive areas and encouraging growth where it's most appropriate.
Questions? Oh, you got some more. Next steps.
That's it. So.
Okay, Tom?
The R4, R6 interim. If those were to be only R1, do you know, would we still meet the GMA targets?
Excellent question. We don't know the answer to that. That is beyond the lit review. That's
Right,
kind of
fair
the next
enough.
step of
Yeah, okay.
analysis to frame some of that up.
But did I understand, Kathy, you say that a lot of the R4, R6 that we inherited from King County may have been R1 before we inherited it?
Yes, it was. Well, it was.
Considered putting it back to R1, but nobody did anything for 14 years.
Well, no, let me clarify that. The old plan, before we were declared urban,
Oh, okay.
That would be UGMA.
we were significantly zoned more rural. When we became urban, and that was a county decision, much of that changed at that point in time. But it was interesting to look at the old map, which had higher density zoning along the lakefront
Yeah, that is
and around
interesting, yeah.
And I think it was, even those are the sensitive areas, but most of the rest of the community was actually R1.
The bigger question I have in my mind, I guess, is as a local community, if we designate it with less dense and the growth management puts more growth on us, do we have to accept it and do upzoning? I don't know. I wouldn't think so either, but that's a bigger discussion.
It is a bigger discussion. We will have it, actually. Maybe not tonight, huh?
I have a comment on that.
Okay, go ahead.
I think it is a bigger discussion, and I think it's an important discussion, because some people have become very concerned that the way we're developing, that we are actually encouraging developers to build larger homes as opposed to building some smaller homes, simply because of the way we have zoned, and we're encouraging them to, for the density that they need to reach in order to return the monetary investments they have, that rather than putting 5 or 6 smaller homes that it seems like more people would like to live in at this point in time and are really having a difficulty finding, instead, larger homes are going in. So we need to find some way, perhaps in our zoning code and our other regulations, to kind of maybe mitigate that and encourage more small homes.
I'm struggling with how zoning would impact that, but.
Well, it's whether it's net or gross or what have you.
Okay, got it, okay.
Okay, Tom Odell?
2 questions. First of all, TDRs for Kelly. Are we envisioning TDRs simply within the city, or have Sammamish become a sending site for other locations outside our boundaries?
So currently, our code and our TDR program only covers TDR transfers within the city to the town center. At our presentation to council on February 13th, you asked us to do some further analysis on sending our TDRs outside, and we are currently working on that. So we hope to have an update to you here soon.
Okay. The second question is probably one for Jeff. Is there such a thing as an R2?
Not in our code currently, but there is such a thing.
Okay,
R3, R5.
okay.
Sure. If you're asking, so how we would go about establishing that would be we would have to create that zoning district and put it into our code under our zoning chapter and incorporate it into our comp plan as well.
Okay, thank you.
Bob?
Thank you. I'm wondering if this would be helpful for the other council members. It seems like it would be helpful for me, but I certainly wouldn't want staff to bury their time or have to hire a consultant to really try to put some kind of scale or metric on just the zoning that we have right now, so that we could have number of, R1 lots that are out there, and maybe where they are, some kind of metrics that we can analyze the interim zoning, so we can actually look at a chart and see how many units would be impacted as we looked at that in particular critical areas. Because you look at the map and it's one thing to see it, but as I said, I can see development in there that's probably R4, but it looks like it's R1. It may not be as big as we even think on some of this. It may be much larger if you start doing some multipliers by the number of units. So if the staff could, with current data that's out there, not recreating the wheel in many places, if you could put some analysis together like that, it might be very helpful.
Yeah, and that's before we perhaps get into decision-making mode at some point in the near future between rezoning, TDRs, and so forth. As Tom Hornish asked a somewhat similar question at the beginning of the Q&A here, to me that seems like the next logical step is to go into that first layer of analysis and frame some of those numbers up. How much time and effort that will take, we don't know that just yet, but to work with Lyman and Steve, our Public Works Director, and staff to frame that up. Here's what we want to do. What information do we have to work with? Do we need to gather more to be able to do that? How long will the analysis take? We'll find that out. I believe we can answer those questions and report back to council on what that effort will entail, and then perhaps receive direction at that point.
All about priorities.
True, and data.
Yeah.
We think we might be able to get some of the data both from the GIS system as well as perhaps the assessor's office
Easily
to
have
assist
it,
us with that.
Maybe we could have some students do some work, huh?
Yeah.
From Central Washington.
There you go.
Romero?
Yeah, I think some of this information already exists because the city has provided us in the past that we have that 2.5%, 355 acres. So they've done some calculation of what is developable, new development, and the 7.5% that's redevelopable. And I thought there existed a map where you had done that out there. So I think that already exists, at least in calculating that we know where those lands are and how that's going to be able to be looked at, which would address it. I also wanted to raise that I think there's a broader discussion that's tangential to today, but very much relevant to what was talked about earlier, and Kathy had raised this issue, is that as we talk about the trail and East Lake Sammamish Trail, it was the county that raised the densities down there that encouraged the development of those properties. And then they went forward and put in the sewage lines, which then was to facilitate that development. So they created what they now complain about of the development and housing that's taking place over there. That needs to be remembered in those discussions. And when we look at that this is a monster they created on their own will. So, and they're actually going to expand it with what they're going to be doing with the sewage diversion later on. Thank you.
Yeah, good point. What Tom brought up earlier about how might the target change if we downzone those R1 to R6 areas?
The interim, yeah.
Yeah. All those that are under the overlay, the erosion hazard near sensitive water body, we've already counted them as only one house per parcel, right?
So,
We did?
good point, Mayor. We had that discussion a couple weeks ago when we were talking about the pilot program interim regulation. So for those critical areas that are spelled out in our code, you're right. Those provisions, we do apply the net density to those parcels, subtracting out critical area and critical area buffers. When we were talking, and I might ask David to jump in here, but the erosion hazard near sensitive water body overlay, as we discussed a couple weeks ago, the no disturbance area, help me make sure I get this right. The no disturbance area does not count towards density, correct? But being in the overlay does count. No, I got that wrong. That's why he's here. Correct me,
So
please.
the question was with regard to net density, correct? And what is detracted? So you have gross land, and then from that you detract out wetlands and wetland buffers, streams and stream buffers, and steep slopes and steep slope buffers. And then in addition to that, any dedicated roads that are required within the division. So that's how you get net density.
But that's not the question.
That's not the question.
The erosion hazard near sensitive water body says that you can only build one house per parcel. So was that calculated in the target that we have? Rather than R6, it's if you have 10 acres with R6, instead of having 60 possible, you only have one possible.
In the no disturbance area.
Right.
Right.
So how was it counted towards the growth target?
I have not seen the calculation that was done. I've not actually studied that at all. Other cities where I've done it before, that would have been a factor that would have been included. So my hope is that was included, but I can't answer that for sure.
Okay.
That is, to be clear though, that is staff's understanding. Anything that was supposed to come out came out for that calculation.
Okay. Tom, you have a follow-up?
So along those same lines, if somebody is zoned R4 in that, even though they can only build one, can they sell a TDR?
That's part of the question. We believe the answer to that is yes. We believe that if you are in the erosion hazard near sensitive, the erosion hazard overlay, which would include the erosion hazard near sensitive water body and the no disturbance area, that if you are in the no disturbance area, that you could, and so say the only constraint on the property was the fact that you're in the no disturbance area, and say you had a 5-acre lot in the R4, you have 20 units.
You've got 19 TDRs, yeah.
That you could put one house on the property and theoretically sell it, or you could sell all 20 and then just put the entire property in conservation.
Yeah, okay. Interesting.
Kathy?
Could you possibly, and I don't want to press if it's going to take a lot of time, I'm wondering if you can look at how those numbers were actually calculated in terms of the overlays. Because at our last comp plan, there was significant discussion and concern among our community that some of the overlays had disappeared and were not being included. So I'm not sure exactly how they disappeared, and then so how that would have impacted the count.
So to clarify, the question is with regard to the previous buildable lands analysis that was
Correct.
done, and then units that were potential units here in the city, how the special overlays might have influenced the calculations that were being done.
Right.
And were the overlays altered?
So I know, having read through the code probably too many times, that in 21A50, which is the critical areas section of the code, that many of those special overlays that in the older versions that were referenced more robustly, the references had changed. They are still referenced throughout, although the implication that surrounds them changed as a result. Some of the critical areas, by definition, changed as well during the 2013 critical areas update process. So for example, the no disturbance area is a direct result of, I believe, the SO 180, is that what it was? That was the 190. So basically what happened there was the erosion hazard near sensitive water body no disturbance area is the result of a previous special overlay that had been in place.
Right.
And the references to that special overlay were removed in favor of it becoming an actual part of a critical area.
Yeah, and that's my concern, because initially it was a P suffix, then it went into an overlay. And I know during the comp plan discussion, a lot of activists who have been following this for years were concerned that the changes were going to allow more building in some of those areas. So I'm wondering if that actually got into the buildable lands. And now that we've got the overlays back, whether that needs to be adjusted. Thank you.
So it sounds like we have some further work that we'd like to see staff do. And Jeff, I think you said that you're going to do a little study as to how much time it'll take.
We'll do an assessment of how much time it will take, and perhaps we can do some low-hanging fruit and get back to council on that if we find that things are a bit more difficult than we anticipate. But we'll circle back with council.
It looks like there are two areas to look at. One is whether the R1 to 6 areas should be actually downzoned. That wouldn't require a change in the comp plan because we already have them as a range of R1 to R6. And the other is whether there are R1 areas that really have, and you've determined that there are R1 areas that don't have critical areas involved, whether they're legitimately eligible for upzoning. So it would seem that those are two issues to work on.
Just to clarification, you said that those interim zonings were a range. Are they a range?
They're, in the comp plan, they're arranged from R1 to R6, which means we don't have to change the comp plan to change the zoning
That's
within that
correct.
range.
Yep.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Very good. We are on to urban forestry now.
Okay, we're going to change over slides here. And I'm just going to, so we touched on this earlier during the department presentation. Staff would like to talk about a scope of work for the urban forestry management plan with council here this evening. And I'm just going to have, I think Kelly and David Goodman are going to make a short presentation on this, and then we can have some discussion about it.
Hello again.
Hi.
So, as Jeff mentioned, going to talk a little bit about the upcoming urban forest management plan. Main purpose of this presentation is to do a little review on where we've been and where we're going. And we're going to present to you our scope of work that we're going to be sending out in our RFP. And hopefully, with the council's blessing, we'll be able to solidify that and then send out our RFP later this year, and hopefully have a consultant on board and working by the early winter, late fall. So quick background. There's a comprehensive plan policy, EC 1010, that directs the city to create and support a robust and comprehensive urban forest management plan. There were 4 scoping meetings held last year with combinations of the council, the planning commission, and the parks commission, where we talked a little bit about what an urban forest management plan is, what its goals are, and we came up with kind of a draft mission, vision, and scope of work that I'll share in just a moment. And based on that input, on the mission, vision, scope of work, et cetera, the staff, we developed a draft scope of work that we hope to then turn into an RFP. So, as you know, council approved $115,000 for professional services related to the urban forest management plan. And just a couple months ago, the city also received a $15,000 grant from the State Department of Natural Resources to help with our canopy cover assessment, which is going to be one of the first items on the list on the to-do list for the third item on here, which is the University of Washington's Urban Ecology Lab. So they will be under a separate contract than the consultant that I'm going to be referring to throughout this presentation, but they will be working in concert with one another, and the canopy cover assessment that they complete is going to be a really key foundation for the rest of the urban forest management plan. And I should mention, in addition to that, the urban ecology team is going to be doing some policy review. They're going to be working with our consultant to add their particular scientific knowledge to some of the goals and policies that we're going to be adopting through the urban forest management plan. So just one important other piece of background information. There's a lot of, I think a lot of people have a lot of great expectations for this plan, which is fantastic, but we also just want to make sure that we set the scope for what an urban forest management plan actually is, and what the urban forest itself actually is. So generally, I think this is from the USDA Forest Service. The urban forest refers to all publicly and privately owned trees within an urban area. So as an extension of that, what an urban forest management plan does is create a shared community vision for the future of the urban forest. It highlights and incorporates information from data gathering exercises like the canopy cover assessment that the UW team will be doing. It will establish goals relating to the health management and extent of the urban forest, and it will also identify steps to reach those goals. It will establish shared priorities across departments. So we have at least 3 departments at the city who touch on various urban forest management related activities. So part of this plan is going to be to bring all of those programs under a common set of goals. And the plan may result in the development of new programs and regulations. So that segues into my next slide here. As much as I don't want to go negative, what is an urban forest management plan is not. It is not a regulatory document. It's not a section of the municipal code. It is not a program, a budget, nor is it a maintenance guide. But what it is a document that will set the framework for all of these things to come afterwards. So there's not going to be any, as I mentioned, there's not going to be any regulations or new rules in this document, but what the document's going to do is set the city's priorities and goals, and then the rules and regulations are going to follow that. The rules and regulations are going to be developed with those priorities in mind. So I'll just briefly go over the mission and vision statements that we came up with through our conversations with council and the planning and parks commissions. And just to be clear, these are certainly open to change as we go throughout the process, but the purpose of this exercise was just to, essentially give the project a little bit of form before we go out for an RFP. And also to give our potential consultants a bit of an idea of what we're looking for. But these certainly are subject to change depending on what sort of community priorities come up through the planning process and what sort of input our consultants have.
Hopefully not tonight.
Hopefully not, no.
Hopefully we won't change the vision tonight.
Oh.
So I'll just read this real quickly. The vision was the Sammamish urban forest is a healthy and sustainable mix of trees, shrubs, and other associated vegetation that functions as a connected ecosystem. It's valued and cared for by the greater Sammamish community because of the abundant environmental, economic, educational, aesthetic, and health benefits that the urban forest provides to current and future generations. And so that was some aspirational vision, and then kind of the hard tax mission here for the document itself is that it will be a guide and an action plan that the community will use to enhance, protect, and manage the urban forest. It will set ambitious but attainable goals, identify the tools to reach those goals, and establish metrics to quantify the city's progress towards those goals. It will be a collaborative effort between city leadership, staff, and the public, and reflect the high value that the community places on the natural environment. Successful implementation of the plan will result in a thriving urban forest that is visibly evident to those who enter Sammamish. So as I mentioned, that's sort of an amalgamation of all the feedback that we received from the council and the commissions. But again, it's subject to change as we go through the planning process. But again, this is mostly just meant to have a starting point and give our consultant an idea of what the city's interested in. So the main matter at hand today is the scope of work. So I've truncated a bit for the presentation here, but we have 7 items on our scope of work. One item that had been on the scope of work, actually 2 items that had been on the scope of work but are no longer on the scope of work. One is the canopy cover assessment, which, as I mentioned, is now going to be under the purview of the UW Urban Ecology Lab team. And the second is a tree inventory, which after some discussion, we determined we probably is not required for this particular project, and we already feel that we have enough data to move ahead in a successful way.
So let me clarify. So on item number 3, on the urban forestry report, number 2 will be struck?
What?
So
When you're saying the scope of work, I believe this is
yes.
the scope of work.
So the number 2 on the scope of work. So I shouldn't say it's removed from the scope of work, but I should clarify.
It's been shifted to somebody else.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. So previously we were thinking that the main consultant that we had would do the planning process as well as the canopy cover assessment, but we now have the UW team solely in charge of the canopy cover assessment, and the consultant will be involved, but not the people who are going to actually do the work.
And did you say another one was dropped too? That 2 of them were?
Yes, the tree inventory piece.
Tree inventory.
Yeah.
Which item is that?
So that's not on here. Sorry, I apologize if I wasn't clear.
Okay.
So number 2 that's on the list here is in the scope of work. It's just changed from the original scope of work that we had just been discussing prior to the UW team coming on board.
So number 3 is establish a clear vision statement. Are you saying that the one we have is just a temporary one?
So to speak, yes.
Okay.
I suggest we've already done that one.
Well, I mean, we could certainly take it off, but I think part of the plan here, most of the discussion on the mission and vision have been at the council and commission levels, and I think part of the idea here is that we're going to get a lot of community involvement to see what their priorities for the mission and vision are. I personally think it's a fine vision statement we have, but part of this process is involving the public in setting these priorities and these visions.
Perhaps a better way to phrase that would be to validate the vision statement.
Yeah, I would say confirm or validate is what I wrote.
Good.
Good.
Okay. So I'll run through these real quickly, and if you have any other comments on them, we can talk about those. So the first is to obtain public input with both established stakeholders and new groups, to work collaboratively with the UW Urban Ecology Research Lab, who, as I mentioned, is going to be doing the canopy cover assessment, as well as a policy review that's going to support the work of our consultant. They're also going to be doing the laminated root rot study, which is going to be largely separate from the planning process here. The consultant will establish long-term comprehensive goals and objectives to achieve said vision statement. To develop a long-range strategic framework that's supported by incremental management plans.
You skipped the vision statement. didn't you?
Because he took it out.
Well,
That's okay.
should be in there,
It'll be
but we've identified it.
reinstituted here.
He did say he truncated these for
Yes.
discussion.
Yeah, I see the tree trunks over here.
No question, Don.
Go ahead.
What about mine?
You just mentioned the laminated root rod that's been incorporated, but I don't think that we've formally voted on that. We had a discussion jointly with Planning Commission, but the council didn't formally move forward with that.
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct, yes.
Just want to clarify.
But that's in the 40,000, that's not
Canopy,
in the 40.
that's just the canopy.
Separate.
Oh, yeah.
Kathy?
Yes, I have multiple questions, so bear with me. I don't know, I'll ask them one at a time.
Well, let me ask you a question as a point of order. I've got a lot of questions too. Would it be better to let him finish his presentations and then we
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, he's going through the list here. Why don't we let him
Oh, I thought
finish?
he finished
No.
it.
No, there's 8 of them.
People were asking questions.
This is, it's essentially it after this slide and the next one, so.
Okay.
So additionally, we hope the consultant will develop actions and resources to implement the plan's goals and objectives, and that includes bringing all the different departments together under the city to have common goals and priorities. Create a monitoring and informational feedback loop so that we're constantly evaluating and measuring our progress towards the goals that we establish. And then finally, developing a plan, the actual document that's easy to follow for both just the average citizen as well as staff who are using it to implement policies and goals. So real quick, just to wrap up, we are hoping that you will give a nod to our scope of work as we presented it here, or however we discuss it in the discussion to come. Based on your feedback, we're going to turn that into an RFP, which we'll hopefully send out relatively soon, and then get going on the work later this year. And there's just a little more specific of a timeline on all of that. So that's all I have, and if you'd like to discuss further the scope of work.
Okay, good. Kathy?
Yes. When we went to the Urban Forestry Planning Conference, there seemed to be 2 distinct groups of urban forestry plans. One that tied to stormwater and one that didn't. And I don't see that as a policy decision for the council to decide which direction they would want to go. Certainly the one where you're tying it into stormwater, which some cities are doing, is a much more complex program. But I'm wondering why the council isn't being given the opportunity to look at that and discuss it and see which direction they'd want to go. And I have other questions too, but let me start with that one. And if you don't have an answer, that's fine. We can work on it later.
Could you be a little more specific as to what you mean by the inclusion of stormwater? I mean, is it more just including it as something to look into, or is it having it as a core?
No, actually, Seattle and Vancouver, Washington have very clear policies. In their stormwater code, they say we have to capture 100% of the stormwater. We intend to have trees capture 33% of that, and we'll have a mechanical system capturing the balance. That's what I mean by incorporating stormwater into the process. Again, much more complex, but it's not being offered to us as a decision or a discussion.
It's on now. I can respond to that. So that would be appropriate to actually embark on that refinement of the vision, the mission, would then steer us into policy making. So that would include a lot of feedback from the community about what the goals are with this. And those decisions will be made by the council with feedback from the community as part of the process. At this point, we're really just talking about embarking on launching the project, on launching the community outreach and all that would lead to refinement of the vision, refinement of the actual, as David said, down to tax, or what was it, the mission of what we're going to be doing. And those decisions would be built into that process of refinement of the vision.
I understand that, but I'd like to see that there someplace, because that's a scope of work that could be a significant change, probably more costly, more complex, And I'm not sure that people coming to a community meeting are necessarily going to do that. Did the Planning Commission discuss that at all?
Not that I'm aware of with that level of specificity, whether the plan was going to extensively include stormwater controls or whether it was going to be more of a policy guidance document. I believe the focus of the Planning Commission discussion was with regards to it being more of a policy guidance document than actually getting into how technically it would apply on the ground.
So that the policy we'll look at later. My second question is that at what point do we ask the consultants to help us set a goal? Because when I think of an urban forestry plan, it's we either want to retain the tree cover we have now with no loss. We want to increase the tree cover by 5% or 10%. Where does that get incorporated in any of these goals so that that will be an outcome and will be part of the scope of the contract? And how do we do that without taking a tree inventory to begin with to know where we start?
So I think that something like that will come a little further along in the process when we have a little more detailed information from our consultant about what their capabilities are and what they see as a reasonable timeline for setting these things up. You know, we don't really know to what extent, you know, you want to have citizen input before you make a goal like that, or what sort of information they're going to need and what sort of time they're going to need in order to feel like they have enough information to make a determination like that. So we see that a bit more in a long-term setting. But that being said, I think it's certainly reasonable to include certain expectations about what we want within the plan and what we want as an outcome of the plan when we talk to our consultants. So if there's a feeling that that should be more explicitly stated in the RFP, we can certainly do that.
Yeah, because I don't see that. It seems to me that some consultants would be able to do that. Other consultants may not have that particular skill set. So to me, that would be important because I think that from an urban forestry plan, we need to know where we want to go, when we want to get there, because we're certainly not we're going to look at the tree cover today, and if we say, let's just pull a number, 40% tree cover, when do we want that to happen? Certainly it's not going to happen tomorrow because we're not going to go out and pull a whole lot of mature trees in and replant. But we need then to be able to set that timeline and to set the measurements. So I'm not seeing explicitly how we are saying this is what we want to accomplish and this is how we're going to measure that we're accomplishing it. So that's one of the comments. The other comment that I would have or question is how do we go about identifying priorities? And I remember distinctly talking with the folks up in Vancouver, Canada, who decided that they really wanted to promote small homes, additional ADUs on everybody's property. Lo and behold, what they found out is they lost a lot of trees, about 10% of their tree cover in the area. So how do we avoid, or how do we make sure that we're setting which is the right priority? And how do we make sure that we don't make some of those unintended mistakes so that and if we did, that we have tree replacement or something else of that sort that fits in?
So in my experience in putting together RFPs and reviewing RFPs for projects, one of the fun parts about putting together an RFP is you can actually ask these questions of the potential consultants.
Good.
And see what their response is.
Okay.
As to, how would you recommend? So what we could do is potentially frame some of these questions as part of the RFP process that we want them to address in their proposals. And then we can compare and contrast the consultant's ability to interpret what we're asking and to put forth a plan to actually work on some of these things.
I'd be happy to send you my questions, and I assume the council will do the same. And David, I want to say that you really hit on a point earlier that seemed very important, and that's how do we ensure that citizens care for the trees? I like to watch book TV, and about 2 months ago, there was an author who had a book on the history of New York's trees, And New York has embarked on a process to plant 1 million trees. And they were asking private citizens, public agencies, other agencies to plant those trees. And what they discovered is that while people were very enthusiastic, they lost about a third of the trees that were planted. So how do we, or what process do we find to ensure that people will care for those trees that get replanted and loved? Because it's going to be more than just us putting some trees in the ground someplace. It's really going to be a community effort because this is going to be on public and private property. I don't know if I was reading about becoming a tree city where they try to make that more of an all-inclusive and try to encourage the community to participate and take care of the trees in a different way than if it's just the city council, the city that's going out and planting those trees. So just my thoughts.
So I wanted to share, a couple years ago, I was at a conference for the Washington Association of Landscape Architects, and I attended a session on GIS and some of the tools that are offshooting from this GIS technology. And one of them, one of the stories that was told was using mapping trees by private citizens and doing it in a way where it tells a story. So private citizens would enter onto a network or log on into a website and say, I have this Western red cedar, and this was planted when my grandfather bought the property 100 years ago or something like that. And they would tell a story. And so there was this, and the community really got into it. And so now your trees are telling a story of the community and its history. And it was a really cool project. And I believe LA is doing it. And some other cities are taking advantage of this website using GIS as a starting point so they can map these trees and then tell a story that's personal to them. So coming up with creative public engagement to look at, and this is something that we're going to be challenging our consultant with, how do we get the community, well, we will have the community involved. This is a very hot topic here in the community, but how do we get them to look specifically at their property, look specifically into their neighborhood? And those are some of the exciting outcomes of this consultant selection that we're looking forward to.
Thank you.
Good questions. Tom,
Along those lines, Kelly, there are 3 white pines that were planted down in the lower commons that do have a history, and for the benefit of the mayor, their origin was the state of Wisconsin. They came out here in seedlings about 12 inches high, and I lugged in about 10 gallons of water over the weekend to make sure they lived. So there is that. I guess I'm a little concerned here about the pace of things. I don't see here, for instance, in the project timeline, I don't see a due date. The origin of this effort was the last comp plan, was pointed out. And that was what, a couple of years ago now almost? So it went from there to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission chewed on it. It's now coming back to the council to establish a framework for developing a real live going forward, teeth in the meat type plan. I'm hoping that by the time we get done with this, there's still some trees left in Sammamish. I'm a little concerned that by the time we get through all this, we'll have lost another 10% of our tree cover. So, folks, I recognize the need for public input. I think, though, that if you ask the average public around here, they couldn't tell you a western red cedar from a larch, or a big leaf maple from a hard maple, or a alder from a birch. So I'm beginning to become a little impatient, and I'd like to see this thing go forward with some teeth. what we've got here is sort of a process. We become overly processed and under-actioned, in my opinion, in a lot of cases, and this is an example of it. I'm not sure what we're going to get out of this, the way this is structured. I think Councilmember Huckabee is absolutely correct that tree cover does play a huge role in any city stormwater issues. Certainly does here, because we have the added dimension of a vertical drop of around 450 feet to Lake Sammamish from most of the plateau. A lot of runoff. I don't know, guys. I'm just a little upset. And that's not really a question so much as a speech, but I'll stop there, Don.
Okay. Thank you. I have to feel some empathy for it when you read item number 1 about the public input. It sounds like an overly exhaustive process. But let's get a couple more comments here. Romero?
Yeah, while I have empathy for being over-exhaustive, woe to us if we don't take into account that, particularly as we start to look at the goals, the vision, and the mission there as they're trying to achieve this thriving urban forest. One of it that's implied into it is the character, where they want to be able to have an urban forest that is visibly evident to those who enter into Sammamish. So this will help define that character as we're going forward. I like seeing, and I hope we can emphasize, you had 2 words in here that caught my attention. One, you talk about leveraging all the department's data collection efforts and urban forest management related activities for citywide goals. You also had mentioned earlier on about shared priorities. So I assume that is we're now starting to look at how do we integrate all of these efforts that we're now going to be taking into a holistic view. So I just want to make sure that the semantics are correct there as we start to look at this. I also am interested in the earlier comment that Jeff had talked about defining receiving sites that we have here, that this is an opportunity as we're doing the urban forestry management plan, and we're looking at developing that thriving urban forest that is evident to everybody here, that we start to look at those right-of-ways and where those are in addition to forested parks, where else could they be, particularly given the number of road projects that we have upcoming, that'll be taking place. I agree with the concern on the stormwater. As the University of Washington is doing their laminated root rod, my understanding is they're also going to be doing a soil management analysis. And as part of that soil management analysis, I know that on other studies that they've done, they've been able to relate that and the canopy cover, which, as I understand, will also be being looked at by them with the LIDAR, as to see how can this impact that storm management from those 2 perspectives, soil management and canopy, and so that we not lose that opportunity as we integrate and leverage these different initiatives that are taking place. As we start to look at the reporting, and this goes back, there are a number of cities nearby here, and we had talked about Vancouver, Washington, the Snohomish County that's taking place now on the reporting and measuring. Lake Forest Park, I met them at a University of Washington program that was just done a couple of weeks ago. They also are reporting on canopy. So there are lessons learned that we can pick up. We don't have to reinvent everything. We can start looking at our neighboring cities. Likewise, Vancouver, BC, as we mentioned before, has done a number of initiatives. They tried that million tree effort and gave up on that. So did Sao Paulo, and I'd be surprised if New York didn't give up on it, because I don't see those million trees when I go to New York City. So how do you manage that and make sure that they're actually being effective? Interestingly enough, there was a study done by Vancouver, BC, and I shared it with our community development director, that the majority of the trees, interestingly enough, are not being lost in the new developments. They're being lost by what we call the slow motion clear cutting on private developments, is what they had, the majority of how that's going. So this has to be the private land, public land partnership, and how do we address forest management across our city on the individual level, not just as we start to look at the other. I'm also interested, and I had mentioned this previously in the last discussion, since we now have the capability of looking at LIDAR and going back into our city into past, is it possible to go back to some of our older neighborhoods in time, and in particular Timberline and Sahali before development, during development, and after development, and get an assessment of their tree canopy coverage that has taken place? Because a lot of people look at those neighborhoods and like the way they've come out, but to see and juxtapose those three before, during development, because obviously they did a lot of clear-cutting planning to have the canopy that we have now, and being able to see that, which would be lessons learned, and goes back to some of the points raised about what kind of house dimensions and standards should be looked at, which would be very beneficial for the council. That is separate from this statement of work, but would be something that would be worthwhile to look at in community development as we're looking at this. And let's see if I've got anything else here. One of the things that, as we talk about this vision and we start to talk about health of total canopy, is what kind of canopy we want to go. I mean, we talked about what exists now, where do we want to go as we go forward, and some of this canopy that we're looking at or modeling, I think, should go beyond just the trees, but should also be looking at, one, the landscaping, how can that be incorporated, and if it can under this, and the statement of work or one separate, in the town center, the streetscapes, and again, going back to the stormwater amenity features, is there some way to take advantage? If we have them enclosed, will that give us some things to work with as well on the stormwater, particularly the regional one, just to look at? Those are my questions for now. Thank you. And I'm very supportive of this effort and getting it going.
Okay, good. Christy?
Thanks. Just a quick point on the LiDARs that you were talking about. If you go on IMAP, you can actually go and look back. I think the first map that they have on there is 1936. You'll be shocked at what you see in Sammamish. Shocked.
We actually,
Yeah, you're not going to see many trees.
No, and actually part of the growth town hall meeting that we had, we showed a picture of Trossachs
Yeah.
that had been clear cut. And now people.
That was my point, is to
people
show
that
how it
live-
got
yeah.
clear cut and what it looks like today. And
yeah.
people understand
And,
how
things
this
can
didn't just
come back.
happen. It was planned out, and by planning the canopy, we got this.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, and that point is well taken. You know, when you drive through that Timberline area, I mean, I love driving through there too, but, you know, one thing you'll notice right now this time of year, a lot of those are street trees that give a lot of the character to that, and those were put in when the neighborhood was built, and those neighborhoods are not 5-year-old neighborhoods. They're, you know, they've been there for quite some time, so those trees have had time to mature. But those aren't related to my questions.
George Washington liked cherry trees.
So, on the financial impact, we have $40,000 listed under the canopy assessment, but we've kind of pulled that out of the scope because we're going to have UW do that. That was originally part of the scope. Was it also going to be around $40,000, and UW is just subbing in for that portion at the same price?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
And also 15,000 of that is the grant as well. So.
I'm sorry,
Is the grant.
Grant, okay. And then we talked a little bit about the laminated root rot in this presentation. While it's not part of this scope specifically, because UW is doing the canopy with an eye towards moving towards this laminated root rot project, which I asked earlier about whether or not council had actually given direction. So I'm assuming staff will come back to council on the laminated root rot pilot project specifically at a later date. And when do you anticipate that being?
July?
Early July.
Early July.
Okay, so I have some other questions before that gets put in our lap as to whether or not we want to move forward with that pilot project, because, you know, as I went back and rewatched that meeting where UW was here and was discussing it with us, and one thing that they mentioned is that laminated root rot's been around for a really long time. And if it were such a huge problem, wouldn't all of our trees be dead already? So the canopy assessment, and I want to go back to what Councilmember Huckabee said, unless we're literally going out and counting all of our trees, the canopy assessment probably isn't going to be able to identify species of trees. And so we won't know which ones in the canopy assessment are going to be susceptible to laminated root rot, because we won't be able to identify a Douglas fir from an aerial shot of the city versus a western red cedar or whatever it is. So it would be interesting to get a little bit more information back to council before that comes back to us in July specific to laminated root rot, because it dawned on me that we could spend, because I think it was tabbed to be about $200,000 if memory serves, for that laminated root rot. And my concern is that we might spend $200,000 on a problem that we're creating. I mean, I know it's there, and I'm concerned about laminated root rot. I'm not dismissing it, but if it were so rampant in our city, you know, having been introduced over 100 years ago, I would think the problem would be a much bigger problem right now than it appears to be.
Sure. If I could just tag in here quickly, for the record, Jessie Bond, I'm the Deputy City Manager. We are in process of putting together the contract framework with the University of Washington, and I will tell you this is probably the most complex contracting process I've ever been a part of. It's been sent off out to the state for approval. So what that will do is allow us to contract for the canopy assessment, part one, and also for some additional services that the UW will provide to support our efforts. That's mostly policy review. We want scientists looking at what we're working on and developing and the policies we're writing, including the current policies we have on the books, to give us some feedback about, you know, good policy versus bad policy in terms of tree health. So they are proposed to be added to our team. That contract will come back to the council for approval. It may not make the last meeting in June, but certainly the July meeting. The laminated root rot study, I will just call it, we're getting the blessing from the state to proceed with that research just because we need to get the contract framework in place, but we won't actually proceed without council blessing. And I think this is probably a discussion we may have a little bit in July, but likely this fall. And the idea was that this wouldn't be something that, unless you desire, that we would fund fully. We would go out and find partners to be a part of this process to study the disease. And part of the reason this disease is becoming more and more problematic is we're losing stands of trees, and things like wind throw are taking down diseased trees sooner than they would have maybe a decade ago. Preliminarily, we've had some conversation with the city of Redmond. I know the University of Washington is talking to potential partners, and there's actually considerable interest in this research. So we're not locked into that yet. We'll be coming back for more discussion. We're trying to get this first phase launched, though. The canopy assessment is the foundation for all of this urban forestry work, and that will begin this summer. So a couple parts, but that laminated root rot study is, we have not committed. We've just kind of framed it at this point. I hope that helps.
Yep.
Okay. I had a quick question. Earlier it was brought up about Tree City designation. And we've talked about that over the years. I know our neighbor Issaquah is a tree city. I don't know if Redmond is or not. But as Kathy just showed me, there is becoming a tree city process. And it's not a real difficult process. We discussed it before. And I think it would be a way of drawing attention with the public to the issue. So perhaps that can be included in the discussion of the public engagement.
Yeah, I think that would be a great place to have that discussion with the public.
Good. Okay. How about a last question from Tom Odell or statement?
The Redmond newsletter I got today by email shows they have a tree canopy percentage of 39%, and they've held it constant for the last several years. Redmond. They also have a, what they call it, a tree canopy strategic plan. So I would encourage us to perhaps put this on our discussion list for the joint meeting with Redmond we have scheduled as another item.
Well, they wanted only one item on.
Okay, well, then
but we can try.
Maybe we can take it up in a different way with them, but frankly, if they've already gone down the path of developing a strategic plan, maybe we can borrow from it.
I think we can definitely look at their strategic plan and incorporate bits and pieces of it, make sure we don't miss anything, rather than reinvent the wheel.
Okay, well, that's all the comments or questions we have, and our time is virtually up. Do we have guidance going forward now?
We do. Thank you for your input. If you have further suggestions for council or from council to staff, have questions, please let us know, and we'll be happy to either answer those or incorporate some suggestions into the RFP process. But thank you very much.
Okay, great. Well, it's,
Don, I have forwarded that newsletter to both staff and the rest of the council.
thank you very much, and we are adjourned.